Hello there, lovely people, it's Alex from Nintendo Live here, and today it's time for us to review Pikmin 3 Deluxe on the Nintendo Switch. This review was originally written by the splendid Chris Scullion, and has been adapted for video by me. But anyway, that's more than enough waffling, let's dive right into things. As each month passes, the Wii U becomes less and less relevant, as most of its first-party library continues to be lifted up piece by piece and carried over to the Switch. Why, it's almost like what Pikmin do! Do you get where we're going with this? Pikmin 3 Deluxe is Nintendo's attempt at a definitive port of a game that deserves a lot more love than it got the first time around. Pikmin 3 sold a little over 1 million copies, which is great by many game standards, but not necessarily a first-party Nintendo IP. Nintendo presumably hopes that this time the success of the Switch will give this game a new audience, and it really deserves one. If you didn't play it the first time around, Pikmin 3 follows the adventures of 3 explorers called Alf, Brittany, and Charlie, who crash land on the planet PNF 404 whilst looking for food to take back to their famine-stricken home planet of Kopai. The trio have to search the planet for sustenance, using the local Pikmin population to help them out, whilst also trying to locate their lost cosmic drive key that they need to leave PNF 404 and return home. The first Pikmin had a strict time limit, which frustrated some players who wanted a little bit more freedom to explore without the constant fear that it would all go to waste at the end when the 30th and final day ended and they got a game over. That was me. Pikmin 2 went in the completely opposite direction and maybe gave a little bit too much freedom as a result. With unlimited days and large caves where time didn't pass, any sense of tension was completely gone. Pikmin 3, on the other hand, is the perfect Goldilocks-style compromise. You do have a limit, but it's based on fruit. Every time you collect some fruit and send it back to your ship, you'll make some juice. Each jar of juice lets you survive another day, and there are nearly 100 jars worth in the game, meaning there's still a definitive endpoint you need to have beaten the game by, but it's way more lenient than the first game. At first, your 3 protagonists are separated, but before too long they're reunited and can be split into different groups. Although there are puzzles that make use of this mechanic, they are fairly straightforward, and for the most part you'll probably find yourself preferring to keep everyone together in one massive group when you can. In theory, you could save time by splitting up the groups and sending them off to do separate things, but it's often more trouble than it's worth, as one group could be attacked whilst you're busy focusing on another. There's one hefty exception to this, and that's co-op mode, but we'll get onto that in a bit, don't you worry. Those who did play Pikmin 3 on the Wii U will notice that there have been a number of changes to the controls in order to make things a little less fiddly. Before, you locked onto enemies and objects by hovering the cursor over them and holding down ZL for half a second, at which point you'd lock on. You could then cancel it by pressing ZL again. This was fine for the most part, but in sections where there was not a lot going on, it sometimes made it tricky to lock onto the exact target you had in mind. This time you simply lock on by tapping ZR, and tapping it again lets you toggle through other nearby targets. This means if you want to attack an enemy but end up locking onto the fruit they're standing right next to, you can just tap ZR to switch your focus to the enemy instead. The charge action is also no longer associated with locking on now either. You can just hold X and point in the direction you want them to go to charge and let go, or just tap it and save some time. There's also a new menu that you can bring up by holding the Y button. This lets you switch between leaders or dismiss your Pikmin and divide them up into groups. All of these changes make for a control system that's better than it was before, but better doesn't mean perfect, and it can still be a little bit unwieldy to get used to at first, especially for those who may not be used to the real-time strategy genre, or are more used to using a mouse in PC equivalents. There's also one major addition that will rankle some hardcore types, but it isn't designed for them: the ability to bring up hints by pressing up on the D-pad. If you got no idea where to go next, a simple press will bring up a text box telling you what the next step should be, along with arrows on the floor that lead the way and help you find your bearings. No, it absolutely is not essential, and most gamers will be able to do perfectly well without it, but for people who are maybe less interested in exploring and instead just making progress, or those who are just genuinely stuck of course, it's a handy little feature. Finally, there's co-op, which has been added to the main story for the first time. If you'll allow Chris to speak in the first person through me for a moment, he'll level with you.
I wasn't able to properly test co-op because the only second player options available to me in a pandemic scenario were my gaming indifferent wife and my 2-year-old daughter. Luckily, Nintendo Life's lovely Alex only has been playing it through co-op mode and he seems to be quite fond of it, so over to Alex for the verdict.
Thanks, genuine Chris Scullion and not a terrible Scottish accent. Co-op in Pikmin 3 is an absolute no-brainer. You've got 3 captains to control at once and only 1 pair of hands to do it, so why not share the load with a friend or family member or well-trained ape? The implementation isn't 100% seamless. There are moments when you're both running around as the same character and appear to one another as ghosts, but it's fine and by no means a deal-breaker. When you're not all ghosty-like, however, it's an absolute joy. The initial drive is maybe to go around as a group, but in reality you're going to need to split up in order to make the most out of the limited time that you have each day, especially if you're on a harder difficulty. Functionally, it works in exactly the same way it did in mission mode on the Wii U, and indeed this version as well, but now it's for the whole bloomin' story as well. Sometimes you may find yourself in a situation where only one person has stuff to do, but these instances are few and far between, and player 2 can even just behave as a support, building the Pikmin numbers and grabbing fruit whilst player 1 attempts to push on with the story. You'll need to come together at times, of course, but if anything, that makes the struggle all the sweeter. It's good. Enough said. And that's the end of my section. Accompanying the story mode are missions. This includes all the paid DLC missions that were released for the Wii U version and a new option called side stories. Captain Olimar and Louis appear in the main game, and the side stories are split into 2 sections. A prologue showing what happened to them before the events of Pikmin 3, and an epilogue showing what happened after the end credits. Nintendo has asked us not to spoil the epilogue, and quite rightly so, but the prologue consists of a number of missions that mostly fit a similar routine. You've got a time limit to bring as much fruit to your ship as you can in order to score enough points to earn a medal. Get at least a bronze medal and you'll unlock the next mission, but the fun is in replaying the missions and trying to clear them as quickly as possible in order to improve your rank on the online leaderboards. Of which there is no one at the time of recording because it's not out yet. So that's more or less Pikmin 3 Deluxe. The story mode has improved controls and can be made easier or harder depending on your tastes. The missions include all previous DLC, and the side stories add a little more longevity, even if they aren't necessarily groundbreaking. Sometimes it's just nice to see Olimar again. It would be remiss of us not to mention one other thing though, and that's the game's performance. If only to preempt negative comments in the usual places. It does appear that the game still runs at 720p, 30 frames a second, just like it did on Wii U. Now, this will obviously lead to instant lazy Nintendo comments, but it's worth bearing in mind a few things. Firstly, there's a lot going on in this game, with plenty of characters on the screen at once and a number of transparency and reflection effects going on at the same time. Whilst it's easy to just demand improvements over the Wii U version without knowing exactly how the game was put together, it's impossible to know just how realistic that demand would be. The more important thing to bear in mind, however, is that the game doesn't really suffer for it other than having a slightly soft look. This is a slow-paced game that doesn't really need to run at 60 frames a second, and there's still enough detail here to be able to see what's going on perfectly well. There are many games that would suffer from a 720p and 30 frames a second presentation, but this isn't one of them. It was a great game on Wii U with those specs, and it's still a great game on Switch, despite the internet deciding that this is the next big scandal to focus on. Would it have been nice to see a resolution or frame rate boost? Of course it would have. We're a little bit disappointed as well, but that's all we are. Just a little bit disappointed. Visual improvements would have been great, but it's been improved in other areas and remains perfectly entertaining. In short, Pikmin 3 Deluxe doesn't push the boat out much further than the original Wii U version did, at least in terms of performance. Where its changes lie are in its revamped control system and the addition of new side stories mode. Neither are necessarily transformative enough to warrant double dipping if you're happy with your Wii U copy, but if you're one of the vast majority who never had a Wii U and never had this game, this Switch update is unquestionably the best way to play it. You've reached the end of the review. Ho, it's time for Alex's personal thoughts, and I love Pikmin. It's not a game that I out and out grew up with, but I think I got the original Pikmin. How old would I have been? Maybe about 10 or 11, give or take, something like that. So just before my teenage years, when I was just maturing enough to properly understand genuinely sort of like sad and sad stories and melancholy and things like that. And, yeah, sorry. Just makes me sound really like a really sad child. But the original Pikmin hit me in a way that no other game did at the time. It was this big, bright, colourful game, but at the same time, it was really quite a dire situation, and that's reflected in Pikmin 3 way more than Pikmin 2. So I like it a lot. It's just out and out a great game. There is almost no other game quite like it. And as far as I know, there have been no contenders. No one else has tried to copy Pikmin, at least not to any significant degree. In fact, my partner Sasha was playing the demo and she said, "What genre is this?" And I said, sort of a real-time strategy, but even that's a bit of a stretch, come on. There's nothing else like it on Switch, there's nothing else like it out there at all. I would highly recommend you give this a go. There is a free demo, try it out. See whether you like it. I think you will. I think it's charming, delicious, and I love it a lot.